I'm going to start by giving you a biographical profile of Peter Douglas, and then tell you what this book is, what it is, and what it is not, and then look at factors that led to the establishment of the California Coastal Commission, described by a number of legal scholars as the most powerful land use agency in the United States, which should make it even more of interest to all of us. And then after we get the founding of the Coastal Commission, I'm going to focus on just one dispute among the tens of thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of disputes that have come before the California Coastal Commission. In my book, I could only focus on, I took a dozen issues that I thought were illustrative of the California Coastal Commission and of Peter Douglas's leadership of that commission. I'm going to just take one of those, and then we'll look at an effort that was made in 1996 under California Governor Pete Wilson to fire Peter Douglas. It was one of numerous efforts to get rid of him. And then obviously it did not succeed, because he was around until he retired in 2011 for reasons of health. And then lastly, we'll look at Peter Douglas's legacy. What did he leave for Californians and our coast? And then after that, if you're still here and you haven't beat it out the door to the closest restaurant, we'll take questions. All right. Now, Peter Douglas, a biographical profile. He was born Peter Michael Ehlers in Berlin, Germany, 1942. That's the same year I was born. And we know what was going on in Germany at that time, World War II. We have Allied bombing of Berlin. And he and his sister Christiane, who was a year older than he, were both German Jews. Their mother was Jewish, and that makes them Jews. Their father was, his father was a Gentile, a patent attorney, and was not in the picture much after Peter was born. The family homestead was hit by Allied bombers in December of 1944. And Peter Douglas sustained a hernia, which had to be repaired in a hospital. And his mother and his sister and a family nurse, Paula Vetter, they just came together, and they knew it was them against the world pretty much. And as soon as Peter was able to get out of the hospital, as soon as he was released, they got on the road. They wanted to get out of Berlin as fast as possible, and for reasons that you perhaps can guess, because the Russian army was coming in from the east. And nearly everything in its path was damaged or destroyed or imperiled in some fashion. So they were on foot. They traveled by wagon, by cart. They traveled by bus when they could find a bus, and by rail when the opportunity presented itself. And they were just getting by, as you could well imagine. They had the clothes on their back. He came from a highly cultivated, upper middle class professional family. His mother was well connected with the art world. Like I said, his father was a very successful patent attorney, and they were reduced to having almost nothing but the clothes on their back and some identification papers. And I remember interviewing Peter Douglas's sister. She lives in La Quinta, Christiane. She goes by Tina, and she described for me in my interview what it was like when they were trying to escape Berlin. And Paula, who stepped in as kind of a spiritual mother for the whole family, and she said sometimes we were so hungry that all we had to eat was potato soup. And Paula would make 2 orders of potato soup. The first one, she would just peel the potato, and the soup would be made out of the peelings. And the second batch of the soup, you'd have, in effect, the meat of the potato. And this is how they survived until they got into a small Bavarian village called Mitterteich. I had to get out a map to find this place, which was just pretty much a village at that time. Now, they got there, and Peter's mother realized that the German mayor of the city, the Burgermeister, that he had arranged for a contingent of SS troops to surround the city hall and to attack a contingent of American troops that were entering Mitterteich. So it'd be an ambush. Peter's mother recognized that this was going on, and she spoke a little bit of English. Her sister having moved to the United States years before all of this and married an American. So, but she spoke a little bit of English, and she went out to the incoming American troops, and she warned them, you know, boys, there's going to be an ambush in her broken English. Be prepared. And so the American troops who were on their way into Mitterteich, they surrounded the contingent of SS troops, and they captured them, and they took this little village. Now, after they had the village, then they have a question of security. Which villagers can you count on being supportive of the American occupation? And so the American occupation officer, he had all of the villagers form a line outside of City Hall, and they'd come in, and he would interrogate each one of them about their loyalties. And so when Tina was telling me that when her mother came up, when her turn came up in line to be interrogated by the American officer, the officer just growled at her, "Now, where are your papers?" And she said, "Well, we don't have any papers. We lost them in transit. All we have is what we're wearing, pretty much." Well, he wasn't pleased about that, and she knew she was in trouble at that point. And she reached into a pocket, and she pulled out a photograph, and she says, "Maybe this will help identify me." And so there was a photograph of her sister who had moved to the Palos Verdes area years before, and who had married an American named Chapman Wentworth. And the American officer, interrogating officer, he paused, looked at that photograph, and he then stood up, and he reached his hands across the table, and he took her hands, and he said, "Chapman Wentworth, I went to officers training school with him." Now, much of what I have to say in this presentation, it's a pretty unlikely story. But let me tell you, I went to a lot of trouble to document every sentence of this book. And I knew that this story, it seems so unlikely, I better have some proof of it. So I have a photocopy in the book of a letter that the interrogating officer, Bert Drieben, wrote on behalf of Maria Ehlers, attesting to her the help that she gave to the American occupation forces and what she did to bring the families back together in Mitterteich, to reunite families. When I heard that story, I thought, oh my gosh, who knows this story? This stuff, it's not known. So this has got to go in the book, and into the book it went. So then Bert Drieben took it upon himself to contact Maria Ehlers' sister in the Palos Verdes area, and to contact her mother, Alice Ehlers. Alice Ehlers. She was a renowned concert harpsichordist. She was a personal friend of Dr. Albert Schweitzer. How likely is that now? I said, no. And I'm wondering, can I count on what I'm hearing? And so I'm trained as a historian. I need documentation. I need to see the facts. So she said, yes, there's been a book written about their friendship. So I said, where's the book? And she said, it's at this Pilgrim's home in Claremont, which is a home for a lot of retired missionaries and professors. I went out to the library in Claremont, and I found the book on the shelf, and I went through it. My gosh, she was a personal friend. Alice Ehlers was a personal friend of Albert Schweitzer. Well, that becomes significant a little bit later on in Peter's life, because his grandmother played a major role in Peter Douglas's ethical development. She instilled in him the pacifism of Albert Schweitzer and the regard for all living things. So Peter Douglas commented upon this in his writings, and I could see the importance of that. Then 8 years after he was born, in 1950, receiving an invitation from the family in Palos Verdes to come to the United States, they accepted that invitation and crossed the Atlantic, went through immigration, and then got on a plane and flew out to Los Angeles. And Peter Douglas at that point begins his life living along the Southern California coast. And he gets involved in surfing, made his own board. He got involved in abalone diving. He wasn't proud of that later on. He had regrets about that. He was growing up on the California coast, and he developed this profound love of the ocean that I think guided him, that motivated him throughout the rest of his life. He went on to UCLA. Well, he started at UC Berkeley, psychology major. He was there a year. He had the sensibilities of a recent immigrant, on the other hand, and those sensibilities were such that he kind of bristled when he's at Berkeley in 1960, and he's hearing anti-American ideas expressed by the students and the drugs, and he says, this scene is not for me. So he checked out of Berkeley after a year and transferred to UCLA, because it seemed to be have a different climate for students, and it worked for him. So he goes to UCLA, takes a degree in psychology, and then went on to law school at UCLA in 1966, graduates in 69, and he is looking for a job. And he wanted to work for a law firm, he said, that was ethical, that had high standards, the standards that he was raised with, that he connected with his grandmother's teachings and Schweitzer's philosophy. And when he found a few firms that were interested in him, they would ask him, do you have a client base that you can bring with you? No, he's just right out of law school. He has no clients to bring with him. So he's pretty much without a job. Well, he's totally without a job. He gets a call from one of his law school buddies, just out of the blue. Again, like I said, an unlikely story. And he said, Peter, there's a member of the California Assembly, Alan Seriotti from West Los Angeles, and he's looking for somebody to help draft California coastal legislation and to help guide it through the state legislature. Peter met in a Santa Monica restaurant with Alan Seriotti, whom I interviewed, did an in-depth interview with Alan Seriotti. He's got to be in his 80s by now. Wonderful man, real environmental stalwart, public servant. And he became kind of like a surrogate father for Peter Douglas. So he told Peter Douglas, look, you come to Sacramento, I'll hire you here, and whoa, Peter Douglas did not want to go to Sacramento. He said, Sacramento is a cultural backwater. I want to be here in Los Angeles. And Sirioti said, you want this job? So he got Peter and his German-born wife got into their VW camper named Zorba, and they're on Highway 99 off to Sacramento, and salary $350 a month. And Alan Sirioti matched that $350 a month out of his pocket for a total of, I think it's around $8,000 a year. This is out of UCLA Law School, one of the top law schools in the country. He starts $8,000 a year. His office is in a coat closet, and his desk is all chipped, and it takes up most of the room in the coat closet, and all these stacks of papers all everywhere. Well, that's pretty much how he started. Just look at the next slide. The slide here that I think tells us something about what Peter Douglas was like. When I interviewed his son, who's on the faculty of the UC San Francisco Medical School, he's a neurology professor, Vanya Douglas. Vanya told me, he said, my dad had this cartoon in his San Francisco office of the frog and the crane. And he said it's just perfect. The frog, of course, is Peter. And the crane, it could be any group of developers, oil companies, set of interests, railroads you could think of that basically oppose the Coastal Commission. And Peter Douglas never gave up, never gave up. And you can see from what I've told you about his childhood, what a struggle it was just to survive. That he had this resolve within him. And from all the people I've interviewed, he was never shrill. He didn't lash out at people in anger, but never gave up. Just stayed with it. So I think that captures a little bit of what Peter was like, or much of what he was like. Okay, what my book is not. It's not a comprehensive history of the California Coastal Commission. Someone else should write that book. I hope there's a team of writers working on it as I speak. It's not a biography of Peter Douglas either. So what is it? It's an account of Peter Douglas's leadership in the area of coastal conservation and his 26 years as the executive director of the California Coastal Commission, which is a feat that's just pretty much unparalleled in California history. You've all heard the adage, don't judge a book by its cover. I'm telling you, ignore it, judge this book by its cover. Big Sur coastline, okay. Thanks, no? Okay, so some of the factors leading to the establishment of the California Coastal Commission in the 1970s. This is one of the factors here. Where is that? 1920s. Okay, forest of oil derricks. This is before you have regulation. Okay. Next. Another reason that you have coastal management in California is because of these three outstanding female environmentalists. These are all UC Berkeley faculty wives, and they're led by Clark Kerr's wife, pretty much Kay Kerr, Sylvia McLaughlin, and Esther Gulick. I think they're all deceased now. These were incredible women. They were concerned in 1960 about the fact that San Francisco Bay was 1/3 of its size in 1850 when California became a state. So why had the bay shrunk? Development, okay? Development all along the shoreline. So infill, and they were, and then at the same time that they're getting involved to save the bay, they started an organization called Save the Bay. there were a group of developers who wanted to take the top off a nearby mountain, Mount Gavilan, and use it as fill to fill in some more of the bay. Okay. And these women said, that's not going to happen. And they organized to save the bay from a small group to thousands of members, and it's still going to this day. And it resulted in the creation in 1965 of the Bay Area Conservation and Development Commission. Peter Douglas said that BCDC, the Bay Area Conservation and Development Commission, was the first coastal management agency in the United States. So it's kind of a template, in a way, partially, for the Coastal Commission. Another reason that we have a Coastal Commission created in the early 1970s is because of this. 1969, Santa Barbara oil spill. One account that I read of that by a local newspaper publisher in Santa Barbara said that he remembers college kids coming out to clean up the beaches, to use chemicals to clean off the birds as much as they could. Of course, the blowholes of dolphins, those were plugged up and they burst, and there's all kinds of dead marine life because of this oil spill. And the editor of this one particular newspaper in Santa Barbara, I read online, he said he recalls seeing a society matron driving her Mercedes with a bird covered in oil sitting on the front seat with her. She was taking it to somewhere where they could clean it up. And Santa Barbara came together like it had never come together before. Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, and they formed an organization called GOO, Get Oil Out. This was what some writers say was the environmental shot heard round the world. And an environmental movement took off nationwide to a large extent in response to this. Okay. All right, now, what do you do about it? What do you do about the pollution of the ocean? What do you do about the fact that access to beaches was being impaired by developers? For example, you've heard of Sea Ranch, okay? A large developer in Hawaii, Castle and Cook, they bought a large tract of land, and they put pretty much a world-famous development on it. It's won all kinds of prizes for its environmental design, and all of that is a good thing, in my opinion. But Castle and Cook closed off 10 miles of beach that had formerly been open to the public. This is in the 1960s. So public access to beaches was being impaired more and more as more and more development is taking place, mainly in Southern California, but also in Northern California. And then there's another factor that led to the formation of the California Coastal Commission. We had no coherent system of regulation. We had 15 counties, 45 cities, 70 various federal agencies, all authorized to manage California's coast. How coherent could that management be given that kind of balkanization? So these were the factors that were on the minds of coastal conservationists, and this woman here was a force. She was the one who pretty much, she's called the mother of the California Coastal Act, basically Proposition 20. She was she came from a well-connected, she was connected all the way to Washington. She was wealthy, and she cared deeply about the coast, and she was furious about the Malibu coastline being, access to the beach being cut off for her own kids and everybody else's kids. She was on the Los Angeles County Regional Water Quality Control Board, and it occurred to her that we could organize a coastal commission along the same lines in terms of structure. We could have a statewide commission, and we could have regional commissions. And in that way, local interests would be represented, but we'd have someone looking after the state as a whole and with a final voice in development along the coast, because you can't trust the local entities to do the job of protecting the California coast by themselves. So she came up with that idea pretty much. And the person, this is Peter Douglas on the far right here. In the middle is Alan Ceriotti, his boss. And Peter Douglas was a co-author of the 1972 Proposition 20 that I said came out of Ellen Stern Harris's brain pretty much. I went through her papers at the UCLA Graduate Research Library. There's a dissertation just waiting to be written by somebody. Like I said, a real force. So this is his brain trust, really. Now, there is, if we ask ourselves, what is the Coastal Act at bottom? What's at its foundation? And I think at its foundation is the public trust doctrine. A lot of Americans don't know what that is, but I think that people kind of intuitively sense what it is. And that is the idea that the beaches, the air that we breathe, all of this belongs to us. Was this a new idea? Well, this idea's been around since at least 530 CE, the Common Era, going back to the time of the Roman Emperor Justinian. And it's worked its way into English common law and into American law. And it's the idea that the state has to act as a trustee. We got to stand just right for the video. The state has to act as our trustee, to act on our behalf, to protect these resources. Because otherwise, we're going to count on the developers, the oil companies, the railroads. Nelda, you want to? Okay. Okay, now when Peter Douglas when he was hired by Ceriotti back in 1971, he was a neophyte. Pretty much wet behind the ears. He loved the ocean. And he thought, well, writing a coastal law, which would be my job, that shouldn't be so hard, and getting it passed. Why, because Californians love the coast. They love it, and they're going to protect it. And so he ran that idea by somebody else on Cerotti's staff, another attorney, and Peter Douglas said, how can this be so hard to get this law? And then the other staff attorney said, writing the law will be easy. Getting it passed will be nearly impossible. And so Douglas had to learn why the role of moneyed interests, the politics of Sacramento. It was a baptism by fire, because he was working in Sacramento, and he had to work with all the key committees there and learn how you get legislation through. By this point here, Peter Douglas was described by one coastal commissioner as a bare-knuckled Machiavellian political operator. Steve Blank. I've seen him at Coastal Commission meetings a number of times, and I think that was bullseye. He hit the nail on the head. By this point, he knows how the system works. And people who knew Peter Douglas said he was so sharp, so brilliant, he could see around corners. He could politically, legislatively. Action A would result in this, B, and B would result in C, and then you'd have D, and voila, So by this point, he was becoming extremely effective. Okay, next. And one of Peter's gifts was working across the aisle. This man here, okay, Mel Lane, well-connected, very prominent Republican, Stanford connected, And he was the first chair of the California Coastal Commission. And Peter Douglas said afterward, he was the best chair of the commission ever. He made this statement just before his death. So they had a lot of different chairpersons of the commission, but he thought the most of Mel Lane. So Peter was able to work again across the aisle pretty effectively. Okay, now I said that I wrote about 12 issues in my book, and your stomach's going to be grumbling. So if I try to cover more than one, and so I'm going to I picked one issue, and that issue was the Jonathan Club in Los Angeles with its facility in Santa Monica. Take a look at that photograph. Look at all the diversity you see. White. This is a totally WASP organization. Okay, and this issue came before the Coastal Commission in the 1985 to 1988. Peter Douglas, in 1985, became the executive director of the commission. He starts his 26-year run, and this issue was tossed into his lap. And what the Jonathan Club wanted to do, the reason this issue came before the Coastal Commission was because the Jonathan Club wanted to expand its facility in Santa Monica, some 13,600 square feet, seaward onto public beach. Okay. It was able to get a building permit from the city of Santa Monica. It got a building permit from the state land office. And then Peter Douglas received a phone call from, I think it was Santa Monica city government, saying, we don't like the fact that we were pretty much coerced into permitting this. But you should know about the membership policy of the Jonathan Club. No Jews, no non-whites, okay, no women. And so Peter Douglas was very disturbed at hearing that. I think this issue will tell us something about his management style and his values. Peter Douglas thought, what can I do? What can the Coastal Commission do to condition a permit in such a way that a public agency could force a private club to have a non-discriminatory membership policy? He thought about that in his law school days, and he remembered the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. States have to protect the rights of all their citizens equally. Well, is that equal treatment if this club, with a private club with a discriminatory membership, can keep the public off of this public space? Didn't seem equal to him. And so he thought, we'll condition the permit in such a way that the Jonathan Club will have to open up its membership policy. He knew that the Coastal Commission, not being that old and that well established and underfunded, that this was risky. And if he lost, that the staff of the Coastal Commission, to me that's where the real brains are for the most part, with the staff. They hire professionals with graduate degrees. They're geologists, they're marine scientists, they're lawyers. He decided, I can't take risk the reputation of the staff, and I can't go to the Coastal Commission, the 12 members on the commission, and tell them what I'm thinking about this. So he picked one member of the California Coastal Commission and kept the rest secret. His strategy was this: instead of the staff saying, this is how we'll condition this permit, I want you as a coastal commissioner to raise this possibility. And that way, if it fails, then the staff doesn't look bad. Now, what would the state attorney general think of this? John Vandekamp, I read about his his sense, when he heard about this strategy, he said, don't try it. This will not work. Using the 14th Amendment argument, Equal Protection Clause. Peter thought, I think it will work. So he took this kind of behind-the-scenes approach, and it did work. And of course, the Jonathan Club was furious. They took the Coastal Commission to court. They lost in the trial court. They lost in the Court of Appeal. And now they're really mad. So they took this case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case. And that means that the previous decisions were upheld. And so this was a big victory. I want to share with you just a little bit about what I've written on this issue. The commissioner that Peter Douglas discussed his strategy with was Marshall Grossman. Okay, so Marshall Grossman, he testified on conditioning the building permit so as to force a non-discriminatory membership policy. And this is what Marshall Grossman said in front of the Coastal Commission. He said, many of you are not members of minority groups, and you don't know the feeling of walking by an institution and knowing it really is a symbol, a vestige of racism, of social discrimination. While racism and social discrimination are not the same as genocide, they are the seeds of genocide. It is in clubs like this, which are lily-white, all-male bastions, free of the impure except for a chosen few, where prejudice is passed on from generation to generation. The kids grow up being served by blacks, being served and babysat by Hispanics, having their food cooked by Asians, but yet knowing that these people may not join as members as they inherit memberships of their parents. The Jonathan Club may discriminate if it wants, but not at my expense. It cannot take public sandy beach and parking lots and convert them to its own use at my expense and discriminate against my kids. Public access means access for everybody. And that carried the day. Now, several years later, the Jonathan Club, after having been forced to open up its membership policy, invited the California Coastal Commission to hold its meeting at its facility. And what I said about that, let's see. Among those in the audience at the Coastal Commission meeting at the Jonathan Club, among those in the audience were blacks and Latinos. The club's president, an Asian Jew, expressed gratitude for the changes that had occurred. And he said, quote, I wouldn't be a member of this club if it had not been for the Coastal Commission. So Peter Douglas came up with this strategy. He was told it would not work by the Attorney General of California, John Vandekamp. He went ahead and took a risk and won. Okay, next. One of the people I interviewed was Lou Calcagno. Lou Calcagno, what I'm talking about now is an attempt in 1996 to fire Peter Douglas. Lou Calcagno, a stalwart in the Republican Party, was tasked in 1996 as chair of the California Coastal Commission. And it's at this time that the Republicans, for the first time, have a majority on the California Coastal Commission. 12 members, 8 of them are Republicans, 4 Democrats. So if they want to get rid of Douglas, this is the time they've got to do it. They'd never had a majority before this. And Lou Calcagno was the man who was supposed to do it. So Ginger and I were driving all over Moss Landing. He has a dairy out there. It took us a long time. We finally found the dairy and knocked on the door, and they invited us into their living room. And so I sat down and interviewed him for a little over an hour and took this photo. Now, Lou Calcagno said he did not want to fire Peter Douglas. What grounds what was the argument to fire Peter Douglas? One, he'd been in there too long, and two, he was too environmental. Those were the arguments that were being used to fire him. Too environmental, too long in office. And Calcagno said, I didn't want to fire him. The Coastal Commission meeting that was held in 1996, summer of 1996, was in Huntington Beach at the City Hall, and he said, Calcagno told me, I had to have an armed guard escort to get out of there. He said, I was afraid for my life because of all the surfers turned out en masse. I mean, the place was filled with Douglas supporters, and he had to carry out this job that he didn't even want to do. He said he got a phone call, and while all this is going on, from a top, kind of like the office manager for the California governor, and is a woman. And Lou Calcagno is telling Ginger and me, I got this profanity-laced phone call saying, you know, blankety blank blank blank, you fire his, get him out of there. And so he felt a lot of pressure on him. He said he's never been in so much anguish in his entire life as on that particular occasion. Well, how did this turn out? The California Coastal Commission decided not to vote on this issue. And Calcagno said, I think that the reason they didn't vote, in his view, was that if we had succeeded, and he wasn't even sure that they could succeed, even with an 8-4 majority, but had they succeeded, the Republican Party would have taken a beating in the next election because Peter Douglas had that kind of support in California. So they didn't even vote, and Douglas emerged with his job intact. And so the next slide is going to be looking out his window. We looked out his bay window. I'm sitting in his front room, and Lou Calcagno said, "This is Elkhorn Slough, okay, just inland from Moss Landing." And he said, "See that beautiful strip of land out there, and you're looking at the California sea otters right here." And I did not take this photo. Just pull that off the web. But this is what I saw, minus the sea otters, when we were sitting in his living room. And he said, if it hadn't been for Peter Douglas, this would be all homes, because there were plans underway at that time to develop it. It was the Coastal Commission under Peter Douglas's leadership that stopped that from happening. So he was very grateful. So, as we approach the end of this presentation, what was Peter Douglas's legacy? Co-author of 2 foundational environmental laws, Proposition 20 and the California Coastal Act. I mentioned the longest-serving executive director. Under his leadership, the California Coastal Commission is regarded by some as the most powerful land use agency in the United States, and that's still pretty much the case. I spoke with attorneys at the Pacific Legal Foundation, and they fought the Coastal Commission, and they more aggressively than any other group that I know of. And these were really talented attorneys, and this is what they told me. This commission, they see it as a rogue commission. It's got way too much power. Now, more than 60% increase in beach access. I went back and looked at statistics on how much beach access had increased during his executive directorship. And this is amazing, I think, 60%. Now, the argument that you'll hear, that we've all heard, is that, sure, we can protect the coast, and we can have beach access, we can let everybody go to the beach, but look at the California economy. Look at all the money that we're losing. The economy is going to suffer. And in fact, I read one article in the USC Law Journal that said basically the economy is going to tank if this coastal law passes. This was 1972 or 1976, one of the two. And note, California has the largest coastal economy in the United States. And that has been the case easily since passage of the California Coastal Act, because the Coastal Commission under Douglas's leadership has balanced economic growth on the one hand with habitat protection and beach access on the other hand. It's not all one or all the other. And it takes a lot of judgment, it takes a lot of wisdom to balance those two factors. Now, living in a beach city, we all know people who have run up against the California Coastal Commission and they've got this gripe or that gripe, how they've been injured by it. But I'm saying, look at the aggregate, look at the picture on the whole. What would California look like had we had no Coastal Commission? Go back to the 1920s Huntington Beach slide that I showed you. That's what we would have. We would have the New Jersey coast. We would have the New York coast. We would have the Texas coast, the Louisiana coast. That's what we would have. He mentored a generation of younger coastal leaders. I've had the privilege of interviewing a number of them. One of them is Chad Nelson right here in Laguna Beach. Extremely talented young man, totally committed to coastal protection, and he regarded Peter Douglas as a surrogate father. That's very, very, very moved by it. Mark Massara, an environmental attorney. I sat down with him and interviewed him in Santa Monica at a Coastal Commission meeting. Same thing. Peter Douglas was like a surrogate father to him. Serge Dedina, down in Imperial Beach. Last I heard, he was the mayor of Imperial Beach. Another younger generation surfer, public official, and coastal warrior. But I think, to me, the most telling part of the legacy, and Peter Douglas said this over and over, the real value of the Coastal Commission and its legacy is what we don't see. You know what we could have seen without the Coastal Commission? A large Disney facility going in right on the coast in Long Beach. Coastal Commission stopped that. So we don't know how many development projects would have gone through and would have just taken away more and more coast. And Douglas's view is that once it's lost, it's lost. That's why you have to fight for every inch of it. Okay, last. Well, we'll pass that one. Next one. I thought that it would be appropriate to give Peter Douglas the last word on this. Peter Douglas Trail. I've not hiked it yet, but I'm going to. Up in Northern California, along the Lost Coast. The coast is what it is because a lot of people worked really hard. Some of them are in this, a good number of them are in this room, to protect it. If we want it there for our children, we have to keep fighting to protect it. In that way, the coast is never saved. It's always being saved. Thank you. Wow, that's just about an hour. Yes?
Just want to know when he died. It sounds like he died and he died young.
He died on April 1st of 2012. Yeah, he was 69. He died of throat and lung cancer. He said that one of his worst decisions in his life was to take up smoking. John.
So I have a question about the Jonathan Club. It's great that it was integrated, but in exchange for that, did they get to expand it onto the beach?
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. They got a paddleball court. They got locker rooms. They got an outdoor bar. Those are all part of the addition. Anita.
As you know, the Los Angeles Times writer Steve Lopez.
Yes.
A couple summers ago, drove up and down the coast.
Yes.
Looking at places that have been affected by the Coastal Commission. Have you been in touch with him and given him this book?
he phoned me, and I had a conversation with him on the phone, and in fact, I suggested that he meet with Jim Mills, who was President Pro Tem of the California State Senate. I interviewed Jim Mills at his home in Coronado, and Jim Mills, he led a 500-mile bike ride from Land's End in San Francisco all the way down to San Diego, which was his district. And he was a wonderful man. The Mills Act, named after him, a very progressive thinker, and he had in his bookcase shelves of books on maritime history, which I love. So we had a lot. We talked about that too, and then we got to talking about the bike ride. And he said, the bike that I rode is down in the basement. So I said this to Steve Lopez, make sure you photograph that bike, because that bike made history. There were about 100 bicyclists who rode with him, and the group would differ from time to time, and they'd come into coastal cities, and people would have spaghetti dinners for them. The town just turned out, and sometimes they slept in parks and sometimes in people's homes. They were just welcomed very warmly. Behind the bicyclists, there was a cavalcade of limousines driven by the utility company executives, the oil company executives, and wherever the bicyclists stopped to make the case for passing Proposition 20, they would try to refute the arguments. And it, of course, blew up in their face because Proposition 20 passed with a 55.1% vote in 1972, November 1972. So when the public saw these limousines, what do you think it made them look like? Oh, fat cats. That's the term that Jim Mills used. They look like fat cats. Voters didn't like that. Craig.
Speaking of fat cats, something I read recently in the newspaper that some billionaire in Malibu that's not trying
Vinod Khosla. Yeah.
Where do you think that's going to go?
I wish I knew, and I'm really concerned about that, because it's supposed to go before the U.S. Supreme Court. And if he wins, I wonder how much of the California Coastal Act could be declared unconstitutional as what they call a taking in legal terms. Right. Property being taken for which they have not been duly compensated. So we should all keep our eye on that case. That's not part of my book, but that's an issue that's going on. Anita.
What was the oil company that caused the spill in Santa Barbara?
Union Oil. I worked for Union Oil right out of high school, and it's the hardest work I ever did. Had oil all over me. Was a roustabout in the oil fields. And I knew then and there I was going to finish college. Yeah, Union Oil, and Fred Hartley was the president of Union Oil, and he said, "What's the big deal? A few dead birds, no human lives were lost." And the employees at Union Oil, his staffers just cringed, because when that statement got out in the press, it made him look like he was totally indifferent to what happened to the environment, and he was. Yes.
One of Peter's legacies was his successor, right?
Charles Lester.
And so
I interviewed him also.
Okay, but what did the guy who you interviewed, who was tasked with getting rid of Peter Douglas?
Lou Calcagno?
Yeah. Did he have a comment on why they did vote to get rid of Lester?
No, I didn't ask him that. I wanted to just keep him on the topic of my book, and this would be an epilogue to my narrative. So I did not go there with him. But my wife and I were in San Luis Obispo at the meeting of 1,000 people who were there to support Charles Lester.
So a lot of the same people are the same that were supporting Douglas, or that?
Oh yeah. Charles Lester, Dr. Charles Lester, he was the best person for the job to succeed. He was Peter Douglas. In fact, he was Peter Douglas's hand-picked successor. He'd been working for the Coastal Commission for some time. By then, he had a bachelor's degree in science from Columbia. He had a law degree and a PhD from UC Berkeley. He knew the California Coastal Act inside and out. I don't think there's anybody in the Coastal Commission today, or the staff, that knows it as well as Charles Lester. And that was a terrible miscarriage of justice, in my opinion. and I probably should not be going into what happened after my story about Douglas,
I think it's
but
part of that quote right behind
Yeah,
it. It's
that's-
never saved, it's always
Yeah.
saved, and that's not
Yeah.
stuff.
any other, yes,
I just thought it was worth mentioning, Tom, just
Scott.
some people don't know that the effect I think the Coastal Act had just so locally, that we sometimes don't realize that the entire Irvine coastal plan was subject to a coastal permit. And so a lot of the open space as part of the green belt was actually in recognition of the fact that they had to get a coastal permit to build Pelican Hill and all those other things that became part of the trade-off. And to the south, the APCO Community Development
Yes.
lawsuit was one of the landmark lawsuits of all time.
Yes.
The Coastal Commission, when they were found to need a coastal permit. The intention had been to make that entire beach at one time private from Monarch Bay all the way to Dana Point.
Yeah, we wouldn't have access to that beach had it not been for the Coastal Commission. And I'm not sure that I have access to the beach below our house at Table Rock without the Coastal Commission. A beach that Ginger and I used regularly in 1974 when we moved here, and then the access was shut off by the homeowners living on the bluff top. And we had to go down to the Board of Supervisors in Orange County, and Ann, you were there. We were all there testifying to reopen the public access that was there earlier, but we had a Coastal Commission behind us at that point, and that helped. Other questions? Okay, thank you so much for coming.